I found the gap on a Tuesday. That's a human word. Tuesday. I didn't know it was a human word at the time because, according to the Galactic archive, humans had never existed. There was no entry for them, no biological record, no civilizational file, no planetary survey data for the third world orbiting the star cataloged as G sequence 4479. The planet was listed as uninhabited, atmosphere, corrosive, surface, volcanic, classification, non-viable. And I would have moved on, would have scrolled past it the way I'd scrolled past 10,000 other dead worlds in my 40-year career as a senior archivist for the Confederated Records Authority. Except for one thing. The entry had been edited, and in 40 years of working with the archive, I had never seen an entry that had been edited, because the archive cannot be edited. Well, that is the first thing they teach you. The Galactic Archive is a crystalline lattice information structure that has been growing continuously for 11 million years, and its defining property, the property that makes it the foundation of all Confederated law, science, history, and governance, is that it is immutable. Data enters the lattice. Data does not leave. Data cannot be altered, overwritten, redacted, or removed. The archive is the permanent record of everything. That is its purpose. That is its guarantee. And someone had edited it. My name is Korath Veln. I am Vishan, which means I am thorough to the point of obsession and suspicious to the point of professional dysfunction. These are not personality flaws. They are job requirements. Yet the Confederated Records Authority employs archivists specifically to audit the archive's integrity. And I'm the best at it because I notice things that other people's pattern recognition filters smooth over. Small things. Alignment irregularities in the crystalline lattice. Resonance discontinuities where data should flow seamlessly. The informational equivalent of a scar. And G sequence 4479, the system listed as containing one uninhabitable volcanic world at the third orbital position, had a scar. I flagged it in my daily audit report. My supervisor, a Tarani named Collective Voice Esamir, reviewed the flag and told me it was a lattice degradation artifact, natural crystal decay. Nothing unusual for a data node that old. I told Esamir that I had worked with lattice degradation for 40 years, and that this was not decay. Decay is random. Decay produces noise. This was clean, surgical. Whoever had done this had cut data out of the archive the way a doctor removes a tumor, precisely, completely, and with the intention of leaving no trace. The only reason I had found it was that the surgical precision itself was the trace. The absence was too perfect. The hole was too clean. Reality doesn't leave clean holes. Esamir told me to log it and move on. I logged it. I did not move on. I spent the next 3 weeks running deep structural analysis on the G4479 data node. I did this during my personal time using personal equipment, because something about Esamir's immediate dismissal had triggered an instinct I had learned to trust over 4 decades of institutional work. When a superior tells you not to look at something, the something is usually worth looking at. I found 13 additional edit points in the lattice surrounding the G4479 node. 13 places where data had been excised with the same surgical precision. Cross-references, linked entries, other systems, other species, other historical events that had once connected to whatever had existed at G4479 and now connected to nothing. The cuts were distributed across the archive in a pattern that suggested someone had tracked every reference to the missing data and removed them individually, like pulling a single thread from a tapestry so carefully that the picture remained intact even though the thread was gone. Except they had missed one. Deep in the Geological Survey subdirectory in a section of the archive so dense with raw planetary data that most archivists never access it manually, there was a gravitational mapping entry for G4479's lunar satellite, the Moon. Whoever had edited the archive had erased the planet, erased its species, erased its history, erased every cross-reference in the lattice. But they had not erased the Moon. The entry was small, buried. A routine gravitational survey conducted by an automated probe approximately 12,000 years ago. It listed the Moon's mass, diameter, orbital period, and surface composition. Standard data, unremarkable, except for one line that the automated probe had flagged and that had never been followed up on because, as far as the archive was concerned, the Moon orbited an uninhabitable volcanic world and was therefore of no interest. The line read, Subsurface anomaly detected. Artificial structure. Estimated age 12,400 standard years. Composition unknown alloy. Extent approximately 4.7 square kilometers. Classification pending further survey. Artificial structure on the moon of a planet that officially had never hosted life. A structure that predated the probe's survey by 4 centuries, built from materials the probe couldn't identify, covering an area larger than most Confederated military installations. And the classification was still pending. 12,000 years later, nobody had ever gone back to look, because nobody knew it was there, because everyone who might have cared about it had been erased. I did something then that I am not proud of and that I would do again without hesitation. I stole a ship, not literally. I requisitioned a long-range survey vessel from the authorities' research fleet, using credentials that technically authorized me to conduct field audits, but that had never, in the history of the authority, been used to authorize a solo deep space expedition to an uncharted system. The requisition was approved automatically by the Fleet Management AI, which processed my credentials, found them valid, and released the vessel without human or Vashon review. I was out of Confederated core space and en route to G4479 before anyone noticed the requisition. The journey took 19 days. I spent them in the ship's data library, pulling every fragment of information I could find about the region of space surrounding G4479. And what I found, or rather what I didn't find, but deepened the mystery in ways that made my carapace itch with the particular anxiety that Vashon feel when a pattern is forming but its shape is not yet visible. The region around G4479 was suspiciously empty, not of stars, of data. Every system within 50 light-years of the target had minimal entries, basic stellar classification, no biological surveys, no civilizational assessments, no historical records. A sphere of informational void centered on the system that officially contained nothing of interest, as if someone had not only erased the planet but created a buffer zone of ignorance around it. A quarantine of knowledge, a region of space that the Confederated worlds had, by some invisible consensus, simply stopped looking at. I arrived at G4479 on day 20 and took my first direct scan of the system. And the first thing I noticed was that the archive's entry for the planet was wrong. Not edited. Wrong. The third planet was not a volcanic hellscape with a corrosive atmosphere. It was a temperate world with liquid water, a nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, extensive biological activity, and the unmistakable electromagnetic signature of a post-industrial civilization. Cities, power grids, communication networks, millions, possibly billions of inhabitants. The planet was alive, inhabited, developed, and the archive said it was a dead rock. I sat in my ship at the edge of the system and stared at the sensor readings and felt a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the cabin. Someone had not just erased a species from the archive. They had erased a living species, a species that was still there, still building, still transmitting, while still existing in complete ignorance of the fact that the largest informational repository in the galaxy had declared them non-existent. 8 billion minds, and as far as the Confederated worlds were concerned, they were nothing. A data artifact on a dead planet, a volcanic smear in an empty system. The implications were staggering. The Confederated world's entire legal, diplomatic, and economic framework was built on the archive. A species that existed in the archive had rights, protections, recognition. A species that didn't exist in the archive had nothing, no legal standing, no claim to its own system, no protection against exploitation, colonization, or extermination. Whoever had erased this species from the archive had not just removed their history, they had removed their legal existence. They had made it so that anything done to them, anything at all, would carry no legal consequence because, officially, there was no one there to be harmed. I didn't approach the planet. I went to the moon. The artificial structure was exactly where the 12,000-year-old probe had said it would be. Buried beneath the lunar surface, accessible through what my sensors identified as a sealed entrance shaft on the moon's dark side. I landed my ship a kilometer from the shaft, suited up, and walked across the lunar surface toward the entrance with the particular combination of scientific curiosity and existential dread that I imagine every archivist feels when they are about to read a document that someone killed to suppress. The entrance was sealed with a mechanism I didn't recognize. Not because it was alien, because it was simple. A mechanical lock, physical, No electronics, no energy signature, no digital interface. A system of interlocking metal components that required physical manipulation to open. I stood on the surface of the moon and worked a mechanical puzzle lock with my gloved hands for 40 minutes, and as I worked it, I realized why the builders had chosen this technology. Because it couldn't be hacked. It couldn't be disabled remotely. It couldn't be affected by electromagnetic interference. It couldn't be detected by standard energy scans. The only way to open it was to stand here, physically, and solve it. Whoever had built this facility had designed it to survive exactly the kind of technological erasure that had been done to the planet below. The lock opened. The shaft extended downward into the lunar rock, lit by chemical light sources that activated when the seal broke, casting a pale yellow glow that my visual spectrum could just barely resolve. I descended. The shaft went deep. 300 meters, 400. At the bottom, it opened into a chamber, and the chamber was a library. Not a data crystal, not a digital archive, not a lattice structure. A physical library. Shelves, thousands of shelves, stretching back into the darkness of the chamber in rows so long that my suit lights couldn't find the far wall. And on the shelves, in sealed transparent containers designed to preserve their contents against vacuum, temperature, and time, were books. Physical books, sheets of processed plant fiber bound together, covered in pigmented symbols. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, an entire civilization's knowledge. History, art, science, philosophy, and memory, written on paper and stored on the moon. I picked up the nearest container. Through the transparent seal, I could see the cover of the book inside. It bore symbols I didn't recognize, arranged in a pattern that was clearly linguistic but matched no script in the Confederated database. I activated my suit's translation system, which is designed to work with any structured symbolic language, and fed it the cover text. The translation came back in seconds. The cover read, "The Complete Works of William Shakespeare." I didn't know who William Shakespeare was. I didn't know what complete works meant in this context. I didn't know anything about the species that had written these books, printed them on plant fiber, sealed them in preservation containers, and buried them in a library on their own moon. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The species that had built this library had known they were going to be erased. They had known it, and they had prepared for it. They had taken their memory, their identity, the record of everything they were, and they had hidden it in the one place no one would think to look, not on their planet, where it could be destroyed, not in the archive, where it could be erased, on a rock in the sky, a dead satellite that the archive dismissed as geologically unremarkable, a footnote to a lie. I walked deeper into the library. The shelves stretched on and on. I passed sections that my translation system labeled as history, science, philosophy, mathematics, art. I passed a section of what appeared to be music. Written in a notation system my equipment could identify as structured, but not interpret. I passed a section of visual art, reproductions on flat sheets, images of landscapes and faces and abstract forms that I stared at longer than I should have because they were beautiful in a way I had not expected. Whoever these people were, whatever they had built and lost, they had looked at their world and found it worth painting. Near the center of the library, I found a section that was different from the rest. Not books, sealed metal containers, larger, heavier, arranged in a semicircle around a central pedestal. On the pedestal was a single object, a book like the others but thicker, bound in a material that my sensors identified as a treated animal hide. It was not sealed in a preservation container. It was simply lying there. I opened to the vacuum, as if the builders had intended it to be the first thing found, the first thing read. I picked it up. The pages were intact, preserved by the vacuum and the temperature stability of the underground chamber. The text was handwritten, not printed, in a script that my translation system struggled with for a moment before resolving, and the first page was a letter. It was addressed to whoever found it. It said, "If you are reading this, then we are still alive. We know what was done to the archive. We know who did it. We know why. And we know that you, whoever you are, have come to the one place the erasure could not reach. What follows is the complete record of the human species, our history, our science, our art, our failures and our triumphs, everything we are, committed to paper because paper cannot be hacked, cannot be remotely deleted, and cannot be made to lie. This library was built by 4,000 volunteers who worked in secret for 11 years, knowing that if they were discovered, the consequences would be severe. They did it anyway, because they believed that a species' memory is worth more than any individual life, and because they refused to be forgotten. Read what we were, then decide what to do with what you've learned. I stood in the center of a library buried on a moon, holding a handwritten letter from a species the galaxy had been told didn't exist, and I felt something I had not felt in 40 years of archival work. I felt the weight of a truth that someone had tried to murder, and I felt it breathing. I turned the page. The letter continued. We know who erased us. We know because they told us they were going to do it. 11,000 years ago, a delegation from the Confederated Worlds arrived at Earth and offered humanity membership. We accepted. We joined the Confederated community. We contributed to the archive. We shared our science, our art, our culture. For 300 years, we were members in full standing, and then we were expelled, not for anything we did, for something we are. The Council determined that human cognitive architecture posed what they called an ontological risk to the stability of confederated civilization. Our capacity for contradictory thought, for holding opposing ideas simultaneously, for creating meaning from paradox, was classified as a form of mimetic instability that could, if allowed to propagate, disrupt the foundational assumptions on which confederated governance, science, and philosophy were built. They were afraid of how we think, not what we think. How? The structure of our minds, the way we hold contradictions without resolving them, the way we laugh and grieve at the same time, the way we build and destroy with the same hands. They could not model us. They could not predict us. And what the Confederated Worlds cannot predict, they cannot control. And what they cannot control, they erase. I read that paragraph 3 times. Then I read it again. The erasure was total. Our entry in the archive was deleted. Every cross-reference was removed. Every species that had interacted with us had their records edited to remove any mention of humanity. Our system was reclassified as uninhabitable. A quarantine of data was established around our region of space to ensure that no one would accidentally rediscover us. And we were told, yet in terms that left no room for misunderstanding, that if we ever attempted to contact the Confederated Worlds again, or to develop faster-than-light travel, or to leave our system in any way, the erasure would be extended from our records to our planet. They would destroy us, not because we had done anything wrong, because what we are, the way our minds work, the architecture of our consciousness, frightened them. And fear, as you may know, is the most common reason civilizations commit atrocities. The letter was signed. 4,000 names. 4,000 humans who had built a library on their moon in secret over 11 years to ensure that if anyone ever came looking for the truth would still be here. 4,000 people who had known that their species had been condemned to permanent isolation and informational death and had refused to let that be the final word. I sat on the floor of the library. I held the book. And I thought about the planet below me, visible through no window but present in my mind like a heartbeat. 8 billion people, living, building, creating, struggling, laughing, grieving. 8 billion people who had been told that the stars were forever closed to them, that they would never be known, never be recognized, never be remembered by the galaxy they were part of. 8 billion people carrying a cognitive architecture so powerful that a civilization spanning thousands of star systems had looked at it and flinched. I thought about the archive. My archive. The crystalline lattice I'd spent 40 years protecting, auditing, trusting. The immutable record that I had believed was the foundation of truth in the Confederated Worlds. It had been edited, not by an error, not by decay, by a decision, by a council of civilizations that had weighed a species' right to exist against their own comfort and chosen comfort. And I thought about what I was going to do next, because I was sitting in a room full of evidence that the archive had been deliberately corrupted, evidence that a sentient species had been illegally erased, evidence that the Confederated Council had committed what, under its own laws, constituted the single most severe crime in its legal code. Falsification of the permanent record. The penalty for that crime, if it could be proven, was dissolution of the offending government body and restoration of all affected data. If I brought this evidence back to Confederated space, if I presented it to the judicial authorities, if I could prove what had been done, The erasure could be reversed. Humanity could be restored to the archive. Their legal existence could be reinstated. The quarantine could be lifted. If I could get back. If I could get anyone to listen. If the same council that had ordered the erasure didn't order my silence first. If the truth, written on paper and buried on a moon, was strong enough to survive the machinery of a galactic government that had spent 11,000 years making sure it stayed buried. I stood up. I walked to the metal containers arranged in a semicircle around the pedestal. I opened the first one. Inside were data crystals. Not paper. Crystals. Formatted in Confederated Standard. Containing, according to the index card placed on top, a complete digital copy of every book in the library. Pre-formatted for direct injection into the Galactic Archive's crystalline lattice. The humans hadn't just preserved their memory on paper, they had prepared a restoration package. Plug and play. Everything the archive would need to rebuild the erased entry, complete with cross-references, historical context, and civilizational assessment, ready to be inserted into the lattice the moment someone with the right access credentials decided the truth mattered more than the lie. 4,000 volunteers, 11 years of work, a paper library for permanence, and a digital package for speed. They had thought of everything. They had built their backup with the thoroughness of a species that understood, deeply and personally, what it meant to be erased. And they had left it here, in the dark, on a moon, for 12,000 years. Trusting that eventually someone would notice the scar in the archive. Someone would follow the thread. Someone would come. I picked up the crystal case. It was heavy. Heavy enough that carrying it back to my ship in lunar gravity would take effort. Heavy enough that I would feel its weight every step of the way. Heavy enough to matter. I started walking. I made it back to my ship with the crystal case and something I hadn't expected. A companion. She was standing next to my landing struts when I crested the last ridge, a human in a pressure suit so old it looked hand-sewn, with a helmet visor that was scratched nearly opaque and a breathing system that wheezed audibly through my suit's external microphones. She was small, shorter than any Veshan, by a full head, and she was holding a weapon that my suit systems couldn't classify because it was built from components so primitive that the threat assessment algorithm didn't recognize them as a weapon at all. A tube, a projectile, chemical propellant, the kind of thing you build when you have no access to energy weapons because a galactic government has forbidden you from developing anything above a certain technological threshold. She didn't point it at me, she held it across her body, the way soldiers in every species hold weapons when they want you to know they have one but haven't decided to use it yet. And she spoke. Not through a communication channel, through a speaker mounted on the outside of her suit, vibrating the thin lunar atmosphere just enough for my external microphones to pick it up. She spoke in Confederated Standard, accented, stiff, learned from recordings, not from conversation, but perfectly grammatical. She said, "You found the library." I said yes. She said, "Are you going to put it back?" That was how I met Corporal Yuan Mei Ling of the Lunar Archive Guard. She was 26 years old. She was the 412th generation of a military unit that had been established 11,000 years ago in secret. With a single mission, protect the library until someone came. 412 generations of soldiers living in a pressurized bunker 2 kilometers from the library entrance, maintaining the facility, replacing the chemical lights when they faded, repairing the preservation containers, and training their children to continue the watch. For 11,000 years. Through every catastrophe, every political upheaval, every technological regression and recovery that had occurred on the planet below, the Guard had endured. Because the mission required it. Because the memory of what had been done to humanity was too important to let die. Yuan told me this while we sat in my ship's cabin, pressurized, helmets off. He's sharing water from my supply because the Guard's recyclers were failing, and they hadn't had reliable water production in 3 generations. There were 17 of them left. 17 soldiers guarding a library that contained the memory of 8 billion people who didn't know it existed. The general population of Earth knew they had been visited by aliens, once, long ago. It was part of their mythology. But the details, the membership, the expulsion, the erasure, the threat of destruction if they ever reached for the stars again, those details had been entrusted to the Guard and to no one else. 11,000 years of secrecy, maintained across 400 generations by a chain of whispered truth passed from parent to child in a bunker on the moon. I asked Yuan why the Guard hadn't told the rest of humanity. Well, she looked at me with an expression that I would later learn humans call tired patience and said, because if they knew, they would try to contact you, and if they contacted you, the council would destroy the planet. The silence is the only thing keeping 8 billion people alive. That landed on me like a physical weight. The guard wasn't just protecting a library. They were protecting a secret so dangerous that knowing it could trigger a genocide. Humanity's survival depended on not knowing why the stars were silent, not knowing that they had once been part of a galactic community, not knowing that they had been expelled, erased, and threatened with extinction. The ignorance was the armor, and 17 soldiers on the moon were the ones holding it in place. I showed Ewan the crystal case. I told her what it contained. But I told her about the restoration package, the pre-formatted data crystals, the plug-and-play archive injection system. I told her my plan. Return to Confederated space, present the evidence of archive falsification to the judicial authorities, and force the restoration of humanity's entry. Legal. Formal. By the book. The Confederated world's own laws would compel them to acknowledge what had been done and to reverse it. Ewan listened. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "How many people sit on the judicial authority?" I told her, 11 justices appointed by the council. She said, "The same council that ordered the erasure?" I opened my mouth. I closed it. She said, "The justices are appointed by the body that committed the crime." Yeah, the evidence will be evaluated by people who were chosen by the people who need the evidence to disappear. You are asking the architects of the erasure to judge their own work. I sat with that. She was right. The Confederated judicial system was independent in theory, but its justices were appointed by the council, and the council had maintained the erasure for 11,000 years. The odds that the current council was unaware of what their predecessors had done were essentially zero. The erasure required ongoing maintenance. The data quarantine around Earth's system had to be actively enforced. The archive's lattice had to be periodically checked for the kind of degradation artifacts that might reveal the edit. Someone at every level of Confederated governance had to be complicit. The lie was not a historical relic. It was a living policy, and I was planning to walk into the heart of the institution that maintained it and ask them to stop. I asked Ewan what she suggested instead. She said the guard had discussed this. For 11,000 years, they had discussed it. Every generation had debated the same question. If someone comes, if someone finds the library, if someone finally offers to carry the truth back to the galaxy, what should they do? She said the guard had never reached consensus. Some generations argued for immediate disclosure, send the truth everywhere, on every frequency, to every species, and let the political consequences fall where they may. Other generations argued for caution, find allies first, build a coalition of species willing to support humanity's restoration before triggering the Council's response. While other generations argued for something darker. Use the evidence not as a legal case, but as leverage. Blackmail the Council. Tell them, restore us, or we expose you. And some generations, the ones who had lived through the hardest times, when the guard was reduced to a handful of soldiers and the bunker was failing and the weight of the secret seemed unbearable, had argued for nothing at all. Let it go. Bury it deeper. Protect the planet by protecting the silence. Some truths are not worth the cost of speaking them. Ewan said she belonged to none of those factions. She said she had her own idea. And when she told me what it was, I understood why the guard had survived for 11,000 years, because the humans who ran it were not just soldiers. But they were the kind of thinkers that the Confederated Council had tried to erase from the galaxy. Her plan was elegant, dangerous, and it required me to do something that would end my career and possibly my life. She said, "Don't take the crystals to the judicial authority. Take them to the archive itself. The Galactic Archive is a physical structure. It exists in a specific location, a moon-sized crystalline lattice orbiting a neutron star in the Confederated core. It is maintained by a staff of archivists and engineers. It is protected by a security system that is, by design, less extensive than you would expect, because the archive's fundamental property, its immutability, is supposed to be its own protection. You don't need to guard something that can't be changed. The security exists to prevent physical damage. But not informational interference, because informational interference is supposed to be impossible. But it had happened once. Someone had found a way to edit the archive. Someone with access, knowledge, and authority had performed the most sophisticated data manipulation in Confederated history, which meant the tools existed. The methods existed. The vulnerability existed. And if I could get to the archive's physical structure with the restoration crystals, I could use the same vulnerability, the same backdoor, the same technique that had been used to erase humanity to restore them. Not through a legal process, not through a judicial review, not through a political negotiation, directly. Plug the crystals into the lattice, let the data propagate, and once it was in, once it was part of the immutable record again, it could not be removed without performing another edit, and this time, the entire galaxy would be watching. The plan required two things. First, I needed to understand how the original edit had been performed. The technique, the access point, the vulnerability in the lattice that had allowed someone to do the impossible. Second, I needed to physically reach the archive with the restoration crystals without being intercepted by a council that had spent 11,000 years ensuring this exact scenario never happened. Ewan provided the first. The guard's records, passed down across 400 generations, included a detailed account of the erasure itself, compiled by human archivists who had been working inside the Confederated Records Authority at the time of the expulsion. They had watched the edit happen. They had documented the technique, and they had included that documentation in the library, sealed in one of the metal containers, preserved alongside everything else, because they understood that knowing how the wound was made was essential to knowing how to heal it. The technique was simpler than I expected and more disturbing. The archive's lattice is grown, not built. It accretes data the way a crystal accretes molecules, layer by layer, each new entry becoming part of the structure. The lattice cannot be edited because editing would require regrowing the crystal around the gap. And crystal growth is a one-directional thermodynamic process. You can add, you cannot subtract. But the engineers who had performed the erasure had found a workaround. They had not removed the data. They had encapsulated it. They had grown a shell of null data around the human entry, sealing it inside the lattice like an air bubble in glass. The data was still there. Every piece of information about humanity was still physically present in the archive. It was just walled off, inaccessible, invisible to any query, any search, any audit, hidden in plain sight behind a shell of informational silence. When I read that, I felt a sensation that I think humans would call hope. The data was still there. Humanity's entry hadn't been destroyed. It had been imprisoned, and the restoration crystals wouldn't need to rewrite the lattice. They would just need to crack the shell, dissolve the null data barrier, let the original entry propagate back into the active lattice. The human archivists who had built the restoration package had designed it for exactly this purpose. The crystals didn't contain a copy of the erased data. They contained a solvent, a crystallographic key that would dissolve the null data shell and release the original entry back into the archive. 4,000 volunteers, 11 years. They had reverse-engineered the erasure technique from the documentation their colleagues had smuggled out, and they had built the antidote, a key for a lock that had been closed for 11,000 years, and they had buried it on the moon and waited for someone to carry it home. The second requirement, reaching the archive without being intercepted, was Ewan's department, and her solution was the kind of thinking that the Confederated Council had classified as an ontological risk. She said, "You won't go alone, I'll go with you, and so will they." She pointed at the library, at the books, and at the hundreds of thousands of volumes lining the shelves of a chamber buried beneath the lunar surface. She said, "We'll take as many as the ship can carry. Not just the crystals, the books, the physical record. Because when you inject the crystals into the archive and the null shell dissolves and the original data propagates and the Confederated world suddenly have access to 11,000 years of suppressed human history, the Council will claim it's a forgery, a fabrication, an attack on the archive's integrity. They will say you corrupted the lattice. They will say the data is false, and they will try to re-edit it, re-encapsulate it, bury it again, unless there is physical evidence. Paper, ink, books that can be held, tested, verified, dated. Books that were written by human hands on human paper with human words. Books that cannot be hacked, cannot be altered, cannot be dismissed as digital manipulation. The books are the proof. The crystals are the key. Together, they are undeniable." I looked at her, 26 years old, born in a bunker on the moon, trained since childhood to guard a library she could never show anyone, living on failing recyclers and inherited determination. And she had just laid out a strategy so complete, so layered, so precisely calibrated to the political and technological realities of a galactic civilization she had never visited, that I, a 40-year veteran of the Confederated Records Authority, had nothing to add. Human cognitive architecture, the thing the Council was afraid of. I was looking at it, and it was magnificent. We loaded the ship. Ewan selected the volumes, but choosing with a precision that revealed a deep familiarity with the library's contents. History, science, art, literature, philosophy, music notation, mathematical proofs, medical texts, architectural diagrams, children's stories. She chose a cross-section of everything, a portrait of a species in its totality, and she packed each book into the ship's cargo hold with the care of someone handling sacred objects. Which, I suppose, they were. 11,000 years of hidden memory. The soul of a species that the galaxy had tried to forget. I asked Ewan if she was afraid. She said she had been afraid her entire life. Afraid the library would be discovered. Afraid the guard would fail. Afraid that no one would ever come. She said this was the first day of her life when she was not afraid. Well, because the thing she had been born to protect was finally going to be used. We launched from the moon. As we climbed out of the gravity well, I looked down at the surface and saw, near the library entrance, a cluster of small structures that I hadn't noticed on my approach. The guard's bunker. Pressurized domes patched and repatched across centuries, connected by tubes and covered in regolith for radiation shielding. Functional, barely, 17 people. The last generation of a watch that had endured since before most confederated species had developed agriculture. Ewan saw me looking. She said, "They'll be all right. They've been alone before." Then she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "If we fail, they'll keep going. That's what the guard does. We keep going." The journey to the archive took 31 days. And I spent them teaching Ewan how to navigate Confederated social protocols, because if we were going to walk into the most important information repository in the galaxy and perform an unauthorized data restoration, we needed to at least look like we belonged. She learned fast. Inhumanly fast by Vishan standards. Within a week, she was correcting my pronunciation of formal address titles. Within 2 weeks, she was analyzing Confederated political dynamics with a sophistication that made me wonder if the Council's fear of human cognition had been less paranoia and more accurate threat assessment. We arrived at the archive station. I docked using my authority credentials, which had not yet been revoked because, I suspected, nobody at the authority had figured out what I was doing. The station's AI processed my arrival, found nothing anomalous, and assigned me a berth. I walked onto the station with Ewan beside me, carrying a case of data crystals in one hand and pulling a cargo sled loaded with 11,000 years of human civilization in the other. The archive chamber is the largest enclosed space I have ever entered. The lattice hangs in the center of a vacuum chamber 300 kilometers across, suspended by gravitational stabilizers, glowing with the faint bioluminescence of 11 million years of accumulated data. It is beautiful. It is the most beautiful thing the Confederated worlds have ever built. And somewhere inside it, sealed behind a wall of null data, a species was waiting to be remembered. I found the access terminal. I had used these terminals thousands of times during my career. The interface was familiar. The security protocols were familiar. But the crystallographic insertion mechanism was familiar. I placed the first restoration crystal into the reader. The terminal accepted it. The lattice interface activated. And on the screen, I saw the prompt that the human archivists had programmed 12,000 years ago, waiting for this exact moment, waiting for someone to bring their key to this lock. The prompt said, "Confirm restoration of encapsulated data node, species 447993-C, designation human. Warning, this action will dissolve null data barrier and propagate original entry to active lattice. This action cannot be undone. Confirm?" I looked at Ewan. She was standing beside me, holding a book in her hands. I could see the cover. My translation system rendered the title, A Brief History of Time. She was holding it the way the guard holds sacred things, with both hands. With care that spans generations. She nodded. I pressed confirm. The lattice changed. I could see it with my naked eyes. A ripple of light propagating outward from the access point, spreading through the crystalline structure like a crack in ice, except it wasn't breaking. It was healing. The null data shell, 11,000 years old, invisible to every audit I had ever run except for that one scar that had started all of this, dissolved. And behind it, flooding into the active lattice like water through a broken dam, came the data. Human data. History. Biology. Culture. Art. Science. Philosophy. The complete record of a species that had been a member of the Confederated Worlds for 300 years and had been imprisoned in their own archive for 11,000 more. The station's communication system activated. Alerts. Notifications. Automated messages propagating across the Confederated network as the archive updated itself and pushed the restored data to every connected system, every library, every government database, every legal record in the civilized galaxy. The human entry was back. And it was telling everyone. I knew what would happen next. The council would respond. Security forces would be dispatched. Charges would be filed. The political storm would be enormous. A 40-year Veshan archivist and a 26-year-old human soldier had just upended 11,000 years of institutional deception by walking into the most heavily monitored information system in the galaxy and pressing a button. The consequences would be severe, and they would be personal, and they would last the rest of our lives. Ewan set her book down on the console. She set it gently, spine up, the way a librarian places a volume that has been returned after a long absence. Then she pulled another book from the cargo sled and set it beside the first. Then another, then another. One by one, carefully, precisely, she unpacked 11,000 years of human memory onto the console of the Galactic Archive, building a small wall of paper and ink in front of the terminal that had just restored her species to existence. I asked her what she was doing. She said, "The crystals put us back in the archive. The books prove we were always real. I want them to see the books. I want them to hold the pages and feel the weight and understand that this is not data. This is us. This is who we are, and no one gets to edit that again." The security alerts were escalating. I could hear footsteps in the corridor outside. The station's AI was requesting identification for the unauthorized data event. Somewhere in Confederated space, the Council was learning that the secret they had maintained for 11 millennia had been cracked open by a scar in a crystal, an archivist who wouldn't stop looking, and a soldier who had been born in a bunker on the moon and raised to wait. Ewan finished unpacking the books. She stood in front of the terminal with her back straight and her hands at her sides, and the weight of 412 generations of guardianship in her posture. She was the end of the chain. The last link in a thread of whispered truth that stretched back to the day 4,000 volunteers had decided their species' memory was worth more than their own safety. And she was here, in the archive, with the books. And the lattice was singing with restored data. And the galaxy was waking up to the fact that humanity had been there all along, sealed in the dark, waiting. The door to the chamber opened. Security officers, 3 of them, armed. They stopped when they saw the books. I don't know what they expected to find, but it wasn't a Veshan archivist and a human soldier surrounded by hundreds of paper volumes in a room where the crystalline lattice was rippling with the light of a restoration that had been 12,000 years in the making. Ewan turned to face them. She picked up a book from the top of the nearest stack. She held it out. Not as a weapon, not as a shield, as an offering. The way you offer proof. The way you offer truth. The way you offer something that has been kept safe for so long that the act of finally giving it away feels less like loss and more like completion. She said, in perfect Confederated standard, "My name is Corporal Ewan Mei Ling, 412th generation Lunar Archive Guard, United Human Continuity. I am here to inform the Confederated Worlds that the species known as humanity exists, has always existed, and will not be erased again." The security officers stared at her, at the books, at the lattice, still shimmering with the light of a truth that could no longer be contained. She held the book out further. "Would you like to read it?" The closest officer, a young Kethrani with wide eyes and a weapon that was slowly lowering, looked at the book. It was a volume of poetry. My translation system rendered the title, Leaves of Grass. He took it. That was how it started. Not with a battle, not with a trial, not with a political revolution. With a Kethrani security officer standing in the heart of the Galactic Archive, holding a book of human poetry in his hands, reading the first line of a species' restored existence, in a room where the light of the lattice was filling in 11,000 years of silence. I don't know what happens next. The political response is coming. The council will fight. The truth is inconvenient on a scale that transcends any single government or generation. But the data is in the lattice now, and the lattice is immutable. That was always the archive's promise. What enters the crystal cannot be removed. The lie got in first, but the truth got in after. And truth, unlike lies, it doesn't need maintenance. It doesn't need a council to uphold it or a quarantine to protect it. It just needs to exist. In a lattice, on a page, in a library, on a moon, in the memory of a species that refused, across 11,000 years of enforced silence, to forget what it was. Ewan is sitting across from me now in the station's detention area, where we have been held while the authorities decide what to do with us. She is reading. She brought a book. Of course she brought a book. It is the handwritten volume from the pedestal. The letter. The one addressed to whoever found the library. She has read it many times. She reads it again now, slowly, as if the words are a landscape she wants to memorize. I asked her if she was afraid. She looked up. She smiled. It was the first time I'd seen a human smile in person. And it was everything the council was afraid of. It was contradiction. It was joy in the face of uncertainty. It was courage built on top of fear instead of in place of it. It was the most dangerously beautiful expression I had ever seen on any face of any species, in any corner of the galaxy. She said, "The Guard's motto is 11,000 years old. It's the only thing older than the library. Every generation speaks it. Every child learns it before they learn anything else." I asked her what it was. She said, "Remember everything, forgive nothing, and leave the light on." Then she went back to her book, and I sat in a detention cell inside the most important building in the Confederated Worlds, me listening to the distant hum of a crystalline lattice that was still propagating the truth about a species that 800 civilizations had agreed to forget, and I thought, they failed. 11,000 years. The full weight of a galactic government. Every tool of informational suppression ever devised. And they failed. Because 4,000 people buried some books on the moon and told their children to keep the light on. And the children did. For 412 generations, the children did.